To be sure, the Federals usually held the edge in manpower and heavy weaponry, but only at the margins, and the South possessed a considerable advantage of its own. Although the Union possessed more men, it also had the daunting task of projecting large armies across hundreds of miles of territory, much of it difficult to traverse and sparsely populated. Southern forces could rely upon a largely loyal population, whereas Union forces would have to divert large numbers of troops to guard supply lines and garrison key points against guerrilla incursion. Southern forces could fight on the defensive and exploit interior lines to concentrate against separate Union columns, Then, too, the fact that Southerners were fighting to defend their homeland made their cause more concrete and more potent for them. Finally, with millions of slaves to keep the Southern economy running, the South could afford to send a large percentage of its white manpower to war. That's an interesting and important point, that a lot of these white guys weren't doing much anyway, so the economy didn't suffer much under the aegis of war. Of further benefit to the South was the fact that Lincoln administration had to contend with an all but insoluble political conundrum. It had to maintain as broad a base of domestic support for the war as possible, despite the fact that some Northerners opposed any attempt to coerce the South, while many others believed the attempt must be made without trampling on the constitutional rights of Southerners, including their right to hold slaves. So we're going to bring them back into the Union, but we can't take away their slavery. So he had to, in order to keep support for the war early on, he couldn't come out and say, well, it's all going to be about the slaves, because there was still a large faction who said, well, they can't secede, but they can, they have a right to own slaves. That has to be considered. The North's objective, after all, was a reunion of the states. If that were to be accomplished, it required that the Southern people must eventually choose, grudgingly perhaps, but essentially voluntarily, to renew their loyalty to the United States. The dilemma facing Lincoln was thus one of enormous complexity. He had to find a policy vigorous enough to win the war, but not so vigorous as to forfeit domestic support or alienate the South completely. Okay, there's going to be a rough transition right there because I lost some footage about 3 or 4 minutes right off the end of that, and I don't want to find the book and recontinue from there. So we're just going to finish the Lincoln series up now. I think we've found, haven't we, that it wasn't Lincoln's fault, was it, the Civil War? The deadliness of it was not Lincoln's fault. I mean, the North was raising private armies to invade the South at Harper's Ferry, to invade the South and foment rebellion among the slaves. That was being done by the people of the North voluntarily. So even if the South would have seceded, the North was so upset about slavery they were going to attack anyways. They really hated slavery. It was about slavery. Mozart in the background. It was about slavery. And even if the secession is what some people say it was about, even if that would have gone forward, there would have been an ensuing war to do with slavery. Look at Bleeding Kansas. Some people were really not happy about the existence of slavery. It's like the USSR on the southern border. No better than that. Well, I want to read a bit from The Professor and the Madman. This is an excellent account of the tale of murder, insanity, and the making of the Oxford English Dictionary. I'll be doing another video about the Oxford English Dictionary itself. That's very interesting. But I have a quote here that is relevant to our Civil War readings. I just happened to pick this book up and be reading it finally. It was given to me by my brother years ago. He said I would enjoy it. Never got around to it till last week. Here is the excerpt I wish to read. This gentleman was a doctor. He was a doctor up in Connecticut. They had him transferred to a hospital. Then he went into the field during a major battle in the Civil War. Quoting from page 50, Minor, M-I-N-O-R, signed his first contract with the Army, which first trained him conveniently close to home at the Knight Hospital in New Haven, in Connecticut. Just to give that background information, now we skip down a bit. Now we just skip in the middle of a paragraph here. He was a doctor, okay? This was a war fought with new and highly effective weapons, machines for the mowing down of men, and yet at a time when an era of poor and primitive medicine was just coming to an end. So industrialization was well on its way and medicine was just getting stumbling. It was fought with mortar and the musket and the minie ball, but not yet quite with anesthesia or with sulfonamides and penicillin. The common soldier was thus in a poorer position than at any time before. He could be monstrously ill-treated by all the new weaponry, and yet only moderately well treated with all the old medicine. So, in the field hospitals, there was gangrene, amputation, filth, pain, and disease. The appearance of pus in a wound was said by doctors to be laudable, the signs of healing. Good, it shows pus. The sounds in the first aid tents were unforgettable. The screams and whimperings of men whose lives had been ruined by cruel new guns and in ferocious and ceaseless battles. Some 360,000 Federal troops died in the war, and so did 258,000 Confederates. And for everyone who died of wounds caused by the new weapons, 2 died from incidental infection, illness, and poor hygiene. From The Professor and the Madman. Good book about the making of the Oxford English Dictionary, with a couple of relevant paragraphs there. And to finish up, ladies and gentlemen, let's hear just a bit from Abraham Lincoln himself. His essential wisdom. Now, De Lorenzo makes a point in one of his speeches. He says, "When I was growing up, I just learned that Lincoln spent his time pacing back and forth in a log cabin on the frontier worrying about the slaves." And he insinuates that Lincoln actually was not so worried about the slaves. Now, in the mid-1850s, Lincoln's interest in politics was waning, getting weaker. So here we are on page 4 of the introduction. Lincoln may well have slipped back into private life for good, but on May 30th of 1854, an event happened that Lincoln later said astounded him, leaving him thunderstruck and stunned. What was it in 1854 that astounded, thunderstruck, and stunned Lincoln? It was also the catalyst that Lincoln needed to reignite his interest in politics and eventually focus national attention on him. What was this event that eventually made him so angry that the nation focused on him? It was the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which had been introduced in Congress earlier in the year by Lincoln's longtime political rival, Stephen Douglas. The act allowed the settlers in the territories of Kansas and Nebraska to determine whether or not slavery would be allowed within their borders. They could vote on it. We saw this earlier. It thus rendered the Missouri Compromise of 1820, the long-standing agreement prohibiting the extension of slavery, inoperative and void. Speaking at a Whig convention later that summer, Lincoln attacked the act, calling it a great wrong and injustice. For the 5th time, Lincoln was elected to the Illinois State Legislature, but declined the seat this time in order to make a bid for the Senate. Though he lost the Senate race, having thrown his supporters to an anti-Nebraska Democrat to prevent a win by a Douglas-supported Democrat, he continued his course of action in vigorously denouncing the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the extension of slavery at every opportunity, all the while gaining more and more attention, admiration, and supporters. Within 2 years, Lincoln would make another bid for the Senate, this time for the seat held by Douglas himself, running for Douglas's seat. During the campaign, Lincoln invited Douglas to a series of 7 debates in various locations throughout the state. The debates were wildly successful, with an average of 10,000 to 15,000 people in attendance to hear Lincoln and Douglas in their heated exchange over the issue that was causing a firestorm of controversy in the nation. Now, not too long after all this, or basically at the same time concurrent with these events in 1857, was bloody Kansas. Civil War erupted. Although Douglas won the Senate seat by a slim margin, the debates had served to thrust Lincoln